We have tried to pick topics and guests that are going to be relevant to the African American community. We've had on Shirlene Grant, who was down in Oakland. She's a former press secretary to former Speaker Willie Brown for Alameda County Supervisors. And she had a lot of knowledge about what historically has happened when transportation decisions and the location of freeways and how that affects the African American community, both in terms of emissions and in terms of knocking out housing and what happens when a community gets displaced, whether or not they're truly compensated or truly made whole again in whatever fashion. So we had her on, we had Senator Nancy Skinner on recently.
All right. Hello and welcome again to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we're joined by Tim Cromartie, Executive Director of the Environmental Justice League. Tim, how's it going? Thanks for joining us.
Very good. Thank you for having me.
Hey, no worries. So a lot of people know you from your work at the League of Cities and as a former staffer. Can you kind of, for people who don't know Tim Cromartie, can you give us a little background on yourself?
Yeah, I have a 20-year career in the legislature, started as an assembly fellow and saw the tail end of the pre-term limits era when Willie Brown was still speaker. Kind of got seduced by this place, the Capitol, stayed much too long as a staffer. Ducked out a couple of times to go into civil service. I spent a couple of years at CalPERS in governmental relations. And then I went to the League of Cities to lobby in public safety issues, where I learned and developed more expertise than I ever wanted about cannabis.
Right.
And after that, left for 3 years going to the private sector to help local governments regulate cannabis by writing local ordinances. And as you know, for the past 14 months, I've been out on my own, decided to hang out my shingle with my own operation. So far, so good. Right.
It's funny is that's when I met you and when you worked for the League of Cities and you did all the public safety stuff. Right. And everyone told me that you were a former police officer.
I had that reputation. Yeah. I would make presentations when I was at the League and I would have other officers or city council members come up to me and say, "So what department are you with?" So I've always had that cop demeanor since I was 18 years old.
Really?
People have always thought I was a police officer. I don't know why. I just, whatever the cop vibe is, I apparently have it.
Yeah.
But it serves me well when I have to interact with law enforcement.
Exactly. But never thought about Hollywood, looking for acting gig as a cop. No.
Probably make a lot more money.
Who knows? Well, so now you're the Executive Director of the Environmental Justice League.
Yes.
What is the Environmental Justice League and kind of how'd you get involved with it?
Well, it is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're dedicated to advocating on environmental issues affecting communities of color. And often these are issues that the mainstream environmental community doesn't address. Air quality around ports and major highways where you tend to have a lot of heavy truck traffic.
Right.
And as you know, heavy trucks, the bulk of them are diesel, and that's the worst of the worst in terms of pollutants that we could breathe in. So it's I got involved with it shortly after I hung up my shingle, as you know, and started talking with Russell Lowry. Came in, I was getting office space from you for a little while, pro bono. And Russell sort of drew me in and talked to me about what he contemplated the mission would be, and I was really intrigued. I wanted to do something that I thought would, benefit the community. I did a lot of things for law enforcement. I did a lot of things for a number of other interest groups, and I thought I had when I hung up my shingle, I had a real do-gooder impulse. I wanted to get out there and do things that I could, feel good about. So this sort of seized my attention, and EJL. Has its origins in the planned appropriation of appointment of Mary Nichols by the Biden administration to head the EPA. And it turned out she had sort of a problematic interaction with the African American community and her track record. And the Congressional Black Caucus effectively blocked that nomination. And that sent a shockwave through the environmental community. They reacted by beginning to hire more African Americans. You see more hiring going on, trying to address, focus on certain issues of concern to the African American community. You didn't always see that in terms of the impact, in terms of what they would do in terms of directing resources to the communities most adversely affected by environmental policy or poor air quality, et cetera. So where we come in is we advocate for those issues. For example, let's talk about, in addition to what the state is pursuing now in terms of emissions reduction, it's diesel reduction, which we badly need, as well as aggressive expansion of electric. But let's also be pursuing other things like cleaner fuels.
Right.
Regardless of what the source is, whether it's natural gas or something else, because studies have shown that while you are going to get diesel emissions benefits over time with electric, it's going to take 10 to 20 years, whereas it will take 2 to 4 years if you invest heavily in natural gas, for example. We're not here to advocate for natural gas. We're here to advocate for the most immediate emissions reduction results.
Exactly.
And in whatever form, wherever that comes
air
from.
Today.
Right. Yeah. Right. We need it now. Yeah. Our communities need that relief now, because if you live near the Port of Oakland or Long Beach, and if you're right up, and I know people, for example, that live in proximity to the Port of Oakland, the asthma rates are through the roof. And if you're somebody in that community, you don't care who's funding the effort to clean the emissions or to change the technology so that the air quality is better. You just want it to happen.
So Environmental Justice League, really cool name, kind of like mix of like superhero. Who came up with the name and kind of who's on the board there?
That was Russell's creation. I always likened it to the Justice League of America.
Yeah.
I suggested that we have a similar logo. One of our board members insists that we have capes. So that hasn't happened yet, but our board members are a pretty high-powered group. It's all Black women, actually, and they're a pretty high-powered group. One is Alana Matthews, who is a former gubernatorial appointee to the California Energy Commission. She just ran for Sacramento County District Attorney.
I was like, I bet that name sounds familiar.
Yeah, you probably saw her campaign signs. Yeah. So she's very accomplished. She teaches at McGeorge School of Law. Tiffany Alvidrez is a former chief of staff to Senator Holly Mitchell, and she's now in governmental relations in the Western region of the United States, head of the Western region for Instacart, which is an umbrella company that includes DoorDash as one of its affiliates.
Wow.
So
heavy hitters and all women,
exactly.
huh? Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have Tamara Raspberry Harris, who started as an assembly fellow, as I did years ago, and went to work for, I believe, one of the major utilities for Southern California. I think it was either SoCal Edison or San Diego Gas and Electric. She also is now, like me, hanging out her shingle as an independent consultant. So we have a pretty high-powered group. The last one is Tack Allen, who is the daughter of Bishop Allen, who is well-known here in Sacramento. And she kind of rounds out the group because she has a strong social justice background. She's often advocating in the legislature on education bills that stand to adversely affect the African-American community. And she runs an organization, the Interfaith-Based Coalition, that has a lot of affiliated organizations that are community-based organizations and nonprofits.
Right.
So it's a pretty high-powered board, definitely.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like we had Christina Garcia on a couple weeks ago. She was talking kind of exactly what you were talking about, as you have the Port of Long Beach and the freeways all go down her district and then up and down the 5, right?
Yeah.
So you just have that
it's like this emissions corridor.
Of diesel, yeah.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting, like with your background with the League of Cities and kind of dealing with local control and planning and kind of this whole discussion about homelessness and housing and development. Kind of how does this unique skill set for you all kind of come together to help you kind of help this, 501c3 kind of achieve its goals?
Well, it definitely helps in terms of my experience working in the legislature and then lobbying on behalf of cities has definitely helped me in terms of I'm much more skillful as an advocate. There's a group now trying to get a budget request letter going to get I think a $50 million allocation again for cleaner fuels. And the coalition that's putting it together is largely alternative energy companies, and there may be some oil and gas companies involved, and they don't always have the relationships to go into members' offices and some of the communities that are most adversely affected.
Right.
We met with Assemblymember Holden. We proposed to them that we go in and talk to Assemblymember Mia Bonta, because she's got constituents that are right there in Port of Oakland. And I said to them, well, and they were kind of shocked. And I said, well, look, you need to be talking to those folks because you can pull them in on this. Maybe even if they don't sit on the relevant budget committees or subcommittees,
right? They
are a voice and they are opinion leaders on this issue, and the powers that be are going to listen to them. Now, if you can't if you don't have the relationships to go in there and talk to them, we do. So if you're willing to cut me loose to do that, I'm willing to go do it. So far so good. We've managed to get Assemblymember Holden on board. We're going to be targeting Assemblymember Miyabata and some others to just help have as diverse an advocacy group and as diverse a universe of members who are advocating for this change.
Right.
So, and I have done some unconventional things in terms of, I call it guerrilla lobbying, thinking outside the box in terms of,
right.
Okay, well, if traditional lobbying isn't going to work, what are the pressure points they can get the powers that be to respond? Do we need to go to the press? Do we need to find some research out there? Because right now we're just advocates screaming into the wind. If we can find some solid research out there that backs up what we're saying, it'll get them to sit up and take notice, because a lot of members last several years, they're data driven. They won't respond to, you need to do this, but they will respond to data.
Right.
And they tend to take you more seriously if you say, well, this is the documentation we have to back up our argument.
Right. So, you've talked about kind of clean air and getting cleaner fuels in transportation to achieve cleaner air. What are some of the other policy things you guys are looking at and objectives?
When we look at, for example, there's been a problem since 2010 with the scientific community telling the Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., Department of Food and Ag, that we're using genetically engineered pesticides that are decimating the North American honeybee population. Now, this is an environment issue that we tend to join with Sierra Club and others on. And sometimes we do that. We'll join on mainstream issues, but there's not enough focus on it. The thing that's troubling about this and really frightening is that if you decimate the honeybee population, they are cross-pollinators that we rely on for our food crops, for about 70 to 80% of our food crops. So it's not really smart to have a new pesticide that's wiping them out. I mean, their population has just nosedived. And the feds have been entirely too slow to act, in part because Big Ag is behind these new pesticides. And they're reluctant to change course. They're reluctant to move to something else that, maybe it's less effective in terms of killing off the other the pests that are eating their crops. But the point is, let's ease up on the honeybees, because in time you're going to damage the food chain, and we'll be in a world of hurt, because most of our, you can't just eat protein and beef all the time. Right. You've got to have your fruits and vegetables. No, there tend to be problems if you do that. So we're active on that. We joined the Sierra Club. We joined the NRDC on the honeybee issue. We joined with Sierra Club on things like they took a surprising position last summer, and this is again in response to the Mary Nichols issue. They took a position in support of reparations for African Americans. We joined with them on that, but we also did some research in terms of the fact that there was, the classic 40 acres and a mule after the Civil War. Well, that never happened. But the reason why it didn't happen, and this was documented in a book by Catherine Frank called Repair, there were efforts at the federal level to systematically frustrate that objective and make sure it did not happen. They would have auctions for land, but it would be open to the general public as opposed to the former slaves. And of course, you have land speculators come in and just bid things out of sight of the ability of the average former slave to pay land, things of that nature. So we tend to take a broader view on that, but our primary focus is improving air quality, because we don't see enough action on certain fronts in California. We are doing very good things, with CARB's objectives on rapid expansion of electric, as well as diesel emissions reduction. But we don't see as much aggressive investment on the part of the state or advocacy on the part of the environmental community in terms of, let's also have cleaner fuels. It's one thing to say fossil fuels are bad, we need to wean ourselves off of them, but you've got to have some alternative fuel source eventually. Electric can't do it all. And for example, if you really want to make progress on replacing a power source for heavy trucks, electric is not going to do it, not by itself. And natural gas, on the other hand, there's evidence that it can. So we're just, and I think part of the issue tends to be who natural gas is associated with. It's associated either with alternative energy companies or the oil and gas industry. And for some reason, they tend to be persona non grata, and the environmental community doesn't want to embrace the technology because of who's behind it. So it's a sort of thing of shoot the messenger.
Right.
And our issue is, again, if you're living next to the Port of Oakland and, you and your children have asthma, you don't care who's responsible for reducing emissions and having cleaner air in a year or two.
You want a solution.
You want a solution because it's damaging the health of your family. And I think that's the issue that we need to stay focused on. The messenger isn't really important. Obviously, if there are certain companies out there that are making money off of this, well, that's free market capitalism. Things tend to happen if people can make money off of it. There's nothing wrong with that. Let's get focused on the technology that can benefit all of us by giving us cleaner air. And there was a study recently that came out that even a lot of the coastal cities, where you would think there would be cleaner air unless there were a problem, they have a major emissions problem and air quality issues too now. And part of that is because of global warming, et cetera. But the point is, it's not just a problem of the inner cities or the Inland Empire or the Central Valley. It's along the coast now too. So it's becoming a much broader problem than a lot of people realize.
Yeah. So I understand I'm in a bit of trouble. I hear that you have, in fact, started your own podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about it and kind of some of the things you're talking about?
Well, we're not competing with Sactel Talks by any means, because you guys have a much broader array of policy issues that you deal with. We, for now, we have tried to pick topics and guests that are going to be relevant to the African American community. We've had on Sirlene Grant, who was down in Oakland. She's a former press secretary to former Speaker Willie Brown. Excuse me. She was a candidate for Alameda County Supervisors. And she had a lot of knowledge about what historically has happened when transportation decisions and the location of freeways and how that affects the African American community, both in terms of emissions and in terms of knocking out housing and what happens when a community gets displaced, whether or not they're truly compensated or truly made whole again in whatever fashion. So we had her on. We had Senator Nancy Skinner on recently, which was great, talking about her SB 1075, which is a bill on green hydrogen that would, among other things, position us to compete for federal grants. I think last fiscal year, there was $9 billion nationwide made available by the feds for green hydrogen development. So she wants to position California to get a piece of that action and also stimulate the production of green hydrogen in the state, as well as the infrastructure that's going to be required to get it to the folks like us who are ultimately going to be using it, and also to the heavy truck fleets. And then we had 40 acres just this week actually, and they're talking about conservation issues pertaining to the African American community and their use of state parks in the outdoors. Why there can be a problem with the African American community not being willing to use those resources as much as others. And when you get out to these real rural areas, and they cited the fact that part of the issue is you get out to these highly rural areas, you're far away from the city. When you see the first Confederate flag, you start to get a little nervous. So there's issues there, but then one of the things they're focusing on is interacting with the relevant state agencies to have more diversity among the concessionaires at the state parks, in terms of, and the goal is to try to make the atmosphere in the state parks more welcoming. So again, issues that are relevant to the African American community, we over time are probably going to branch out. But for now, that's our focus. And our mission is to raise awareness of environmental impacts, to have a multidisciplinary network of advocates, organizations that are going to work with us on achieving environmental objectives and develop practical, sustainable environmental solutions. Again, let's have cleaner burning fuels in addition to electric and diesel reduction. One of the issues with electric is it's dependent upon cobalt mining for the batteries. And that is happening under highly exploitive conditions in the Congo and Africa right now, under conditions that would never be tolerated in this country, to the point that some of the auto manufacturers that are heavily investing in electric, they're trying to find alternative sources because they don't want that to become a political problem and blow up. So we're got our fingers in a lot of little pots, but our focus is 100% pro-environment, 100% pro-Black for the time being. We don't have an issue with that because there's other organizations in the Latino community, for example, that have the exact same type of message. Nobody's challenging them on it, but we do want relief and cleaner air quality for our communities, and we want it now.
Right. And so if some of our listeners want to follow along or cross over to kind of see what you're doing, how do we get a hold of this podcast?
Yeah, well, the podcast is going to be, I think, formally launched next week. You can check it out via links on our website, environmentaljusticeleague.org.
Okay.
And we also have a blog where we have a number of articles on there. There's lengthy articles about not only what we're doing in legislation, but, the information on the honeybees, the issue of reparations. And there's just a lot of good things on there that folks can plug into. And we're looking to expand and begin to partner with other organizations in terms of seeking environmental justice grants as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, looks like you're going to be busy this coming year, and especially at the end of this budget session here.
Yeah, well, I'm wearing two hats. I'm not only the executive director, I'm also the policy director, because when I agreed to be executive director, there was nobody to backfill that position. Right. So same pay, more responsibility.
That's the mentality.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, Tim. Thanks for joining us, and best of luck to you. And we look forward to hearing you on your podcast coming up. So
great. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks. Bye.